Welcome, everyone. 62 of you. This is fantastic. So great to see you all. This evening, Dr. Peter Hodum will be presenting a class on seabird identification, focusing on the species that are most commonly seen in our area during Puget Sound Seabird surveys. Of course, there's lots and lots of species that we get here occasionally, but we're going to focus on those that are most seen. But before we get into that, I do want to say thank you to everybody for volunteering this year, and for some of you for many, many, many years. So yes, thank you very much. As I've said before, during all the trainings, this program is absolutely impossible without your help. I cannot go to 190 survey sites all in one day, do half hours, surveys. It's just impossible. So really, really, really thankful for all of you. And like I say, some of you have been doing this for many years. So yes, thank you so much. And thank you for all the surveys you'll be doing this season and hopefully for many more seasons. Um, so I'm gonna start off with an introduction to Peter. Move this out of the way. So Peter Hodum, Dr. Peter Hodum, is a professor at the University of Puget Sound, teaching a variety of courses in both the biology and environmental policy and decision-making programs, including conservation biology, ornithology, biodiversity, and a number of others. Peter's been an advisor to the PSSS program since its inception in 2008 and has volunteered for all 16 years of the program. He is my sounding board. If I have any questions, he's the one I turn to. Questions about seabirds, questions about research, all those things. Peter is my guy, so I'm really thankful for him in general and thankful for him this evening. Peter conducts research on avian ecology and conservation biology, and is particularly interested in the impacts of threats to birds like marine plastic debris, habitat alteration, introduced species, and bird populations and island ecosystems. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, he is studying the ecology, population dynamics, and conservation status of burrowing seabirds, principally rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins, some of our favorites, I know. So yes, if you could all keep your if you could mute all of yourselves, that would be wonderful. That kind of enables Peter to focus on what he's doing. If you want to ask questions, you can do so, and if possible, could you use the chat function at the bottom? There's a little if you scroll down to the bottom, there's this little chat with like a little speech bubble, and you can write your questions in there. And I will moderate those. So if during the evening it seems really, really pertinent to a specific species that we're discussing and you have a specific question, then I'll interrupt Peter as we switch between species. If it's a more longer question that needs a bit more of a discussion, then we'll hold those until the end, and we can have a bit more of a chat then. The idea is this presentation will be about an hour. And it gives us, we've planned for an hour and a half, so it gives us some time to have a little bit of discussion, and even at the end, if you would like that time, you can do so. Okay, Peter, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Toby. Thanks everyone for showing up. I know it's a lot easier to show up to a Zoom meeting on a dark, cold December evening than it is like in May when it's glorious and sunny. And so, but we do appreciate you being here tonight. And as Toby said, I'd like to reiterate our deep appreciation for all that you've done, whether it's been 2 surveys or 100 surveys. With the program, it really is inspiring to see the commitment from all of you, and tonight is just a small gesture of appreciation from us to all of you to say thank you for the work that you do, and your participation in this community. I'm going to share my screen. And that should be okay. So we are good there. Um, and we will get started. You can see, you all know now that we are now working with Puget Sound Bird Observatory. So, in the spirit of any good self-respecting seabird, we migrated. We migrated from what was formerly Seattle Audubon, now known as Birds Connect Seattle, over to Puget Sound Bird Observatory a couple of years ago. And we are also proud to show one version of our snazzy new Puget Sound Seabird Survey logo, which is in the lower right. Was done by a former student of mine at the university, um, a really talented scientific illustrator. And you'll be seeing iterations of this in the coming months. But on to seabirds, one of my favorite topics in the world. And I just wanted, before we launch into the the details and the species specific identification, I wanted all of us to just take a moment to recognize like where we are in our own journeys of learning and appreciating birds. And as you all know, people come into this community science program with a variety of experience with birds. Some are relative novices. Some folks are world-class birders, and everything in between. But I think it's important to recognize that we have these teams of folks with people coming in with different skill levels, different experience levels. And part of the richness of the program is not just the data collection and getting opportunity to spend time with wonderful folks in the field who you may not know otherwise, but it's also a chance to continue our own learning. And are improving our own bird identification skills and natural history skills. And part of that may be for some of you who are more experienced, passing on some of your expertise and some of your identification skills to somebody in your team who's less experienced. So this is a lifelong journey and it's a fun one. Yeah, I think we all agree wherever we are on that continuum, that learning how to identify birds and appreciate them and understand their natural history is something that gives us a lot of joy and is an enriching part of our lives wherever we are on that curve. I wanted to just talk a little bit about how we actually identify birds. And for those of you that are experienced birders, you're not going to learn anything from this aside from maybe reminding yourself of what you learned sometime in the past. For those of you who are experienced birders, you are doing this subconsciously. But recognize you got to that level of competence, that level of experience by going through stages of learning. And that may be where some of your teammates are, where they are still learning those birds, which is an exciting part of that journey. So if we think about the art of bird identification, we are thinking about size and shape. And so again, for the experienced amongst you, maybe think about this as, yeah, these are things that I'm doing automatically, and I may not even be consciously aware of it. But if I have someone less experienced in my team, these are maybe some little things that I can encourage them to be thinking about. So, I mean, we could spend an hour just on this. The point here isn't to go over bird identification techniques in any great detail. But what we're doing, and this is also reflected in all of the algorithms that, that Merlin uses. This predates Merlin, but size and shape, general color pattern, behavior, and color pattern, we're talking not about the fine field marks, but rather the dominant colors and the dominant patterns of colors. Behaviors obviously can be incredibly helpful. Are they on the water? Are they diving? Are they dabbling? Are they wing propelled? You can tell that, from watching a bird and how they dive, whether they're a wing propelled diver or a foot propelled diver. Um, all sorts of things like that. What habitat they're in. In terms of marine birds or seabirds and the birds that we see, are we on saltwater? Are we on freshwater? That can actually be an important distinguishing factor. Not all water is created equal, and birds don't use those aquatic habitats equally. Um, and it's only once we've looked at these, we've kind of mentally, either consciously or by experience, gone through these steps. And it doesn't have to be in this order. It's only then that we're really focusing on those fine distinctions, the field marks, the subtle differences that may be distinguished between species. But you're not going to want to focus on those initially because you're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to want to start with these more general characteristics: size and shape, color pattern, behavior, habitat, and then, and only then, do you really start to hone in on those more detailed field marks. So that's all I wanted to say about this. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to remind ourselves that wherever we are on that journey of bird identification, we are doing some variation of this, whether it's intentional or not, and helping folks less experienced to integrate this information into their own identification will be really helpful. Oh, and I'm going to say call and song for those birds. We don't tend to get a lot of that, especially during the winter surveys for seabirds. But if we're talking about bird identification more generally, call and song, as many of you know, can be a critically important component. And a lot of people can do a very effective birding without even seeing the birds, just by hearing everything acoustically. Okay. We're going to launch right into it now. We're going to start with the ducks, and we're not starting with an easy one. We're starting with a couple of species that can be pretty challenging to distinguish between the two of them. Scops are pretty distinctive to get to the level of that's a scaup. To get to the level of is it a greater scaup or lesser scaup, that's a little bit more challenging. So I've tried to set these slides up in a similar format where the common name is on the upper left. The typical window of months when they are most abundant in our region is below. Okay, so you see greater scaup. We tend to see them beginning to appear in our marine waters in October in small numbers that builds. We have a peak during the winter months, and then they clear out with some stragglers hanging on as long as May. But generally, they're effectively gone from the Puget Sound region by April at some point. So that's the format. And then we've got photos that are hopefully representative. So these are diving ducks. This picture by Kim Stark in the upper left has both males and females. You can see they have this really nice, clean. Let me get where is the turn on the fan? There we go. So I can folks see my little red dot? Yeah, okay. I will also point that out. I will explain what I'm pointing out too if you're having trouble seeing it. But they have this clean white flank, the dark breast and ventral area, and then this kind of iridescent blackish greenish head, yellow eye, and then this pale blue or gray blue bill with a dark tip. You can see this male, the angle is really good. Females, brownish, they've got the white on the at the base of the bill, usually a dark tip. You can see on this lower picture a little bit of that iridescent green on the side of the head. So greater scaups they're the scaup that we're most likely to see in our surveys because during their wintering period, they are primarily on salt water. Lesser scaups, and this is a cheat code kind of, lesser scaups are generally found on freshwater. It's not an absolute, But most of the time, if you see a scaup during the winter months, you can identify it to species just based on habitat. Um, so a comparison of the two, and this is under ideal conditions. Many times scaup are out fairly far. You may have light against you. You may not be able to go beyond their scaups. And that's a perfectly fine identification. If you do have them in good light, some of the principal differences are highlighted nicely in this figure here. The greater scaup has a rounder head. You can see in this illustration here, and the peak of the head is towards the forehead more. So the peak is mainly over the eye. Whereas the lesser scaup, it's a flatter, it's still rounded, but it's a flattened round, and the peak is behind the eye. Again, you can see this under good conditions. There are plenty of conditions in which you're not going to be able to tell where the peak of the head is. But there's the highest in the front, crest towards the back, and the lesser. If you get the right light, you'll often see this greenish sheen, the iridescence on the greater scaup, whereas the lesser scaup, under good lighting conditions, it will tend to look more purplish. There's a subtle iridescence there that's a bit more purple. What's not mentioned on this slide, which is sometimes a helpful characteristic, is the tip or the nail of the bill here is dark on the greater scaup, and we tend not to see that on lesser scaups. So another figure here which shows the greater scaup on the upper panel and the lesser scaup on the bottom. And you can see this dark tip to the bill as opposed to just the continuation of that gray. But otherwise, the plumage is disconcertingly similar. If you look at the pattern, the modeling on the back, there's usually a bit more white on greater scaups, but there's some variability in that. And again, I just at the bottom of this slide put habitat. Keep that in mind. Where am I seeing this bird during the winter months? And knowing that your odds are it's highly likely that it's going to be a greater scaup in salt water during the winter months, and highly likely it's going to be a lesser scaup on freshwater during the winter months. So scaups. Harlequin ducks. So we started with a difficult one. Harlequin ducks are, oh,
Sorry,
yes,
Peter.
Toby.
We just had a question come in. Does the salt freshwater divide stay true in eastern Washington, i.e., where there's no salt water?
No, it does break down, and that's where, like on the breeding grounds, that aquatic division breaks down. So that really only holds true during the winter months when they're not tied to breeding areas, because most greater scaup are actually breeding in freshwater systems, and then they migrate out to saltwater habitats for the non-breeding season. Um,
And then there's
so,
another question here, which
oh yeah.
I'm not fully clear, but it says, is the lesser scaup a mimic of the greater scaup, like downy, hairy woodpecker?
Oh, I mean, they're presumably, I actually don't know what the evolutionary history of that group of ducks is, but I presume that they are just closely related sister species from a shared ancestral species, and they've diverged just enough. And I think a lot of that divergence is probably behavioral in terms of habitat selection, because again, if you look at the body and the plumage, they are very, very similar. But I don't know. I haven't seen. I'd have to look at the phylogenetic tree to see how they fall out. But that would be my guess.
Okay, thank
Um,
you.
yeah. So Harlequin ducks, in contrast, are a lot easier to identify. Nothing looks like Harlequin ducks. And these are they're a fascinating species. And many of you may know this, but they breed in they breed in moving water and freshwater systems, so up in almost in whitewater areas, rapid flowing streams, small rivers and creeks have pretty steep gradients. And then they come down and winter in marine systems. So some of them, are breeding up in the Cascades, but we also get birds coming in from British Columbia down into the Puget Sound as well to winter. Um, they are widespread, but really patchy in their distribution. So they're pretty abundant in Puget Sound, but they're not unlike like a horned grebe where you just put your binoculars up almost anywhere along the shores of Puget Sound and you're going to see a horned grebe. Harlequin ducks seem to be very particular in their habitat preferences. So you see them in certain areas consistently, but then there are big gaps if you look at maps of their distribution in the Sound where they just don't occur. We don't fully understand why, but if you're fortunate enough to have them in your study, in your monitoring sites, your Puget Sound Seabird Survey monitoring sites, consider yourself fortunate. None of my 3 sites down here in Tacoma have them. But the males are unmistakable. Here's a male in breeding plumage in the upper left. Short bill, they're an intermediate sized duck. They're a diving duck. And I should mention that all ducks are foot propelled divers. So any duck that dives, that's not a dabbler, they move through the water using their feet. The wings are in against their bodies. And that's different from other diving birds like auklets and puffins and so forth, the alcids, which are wing-propelled divers. In this upper right, these are harlequin duck males that are in eclipse plumage. So that's the transition when they're in most of the year they're in breeding plumage, but they do go through this molt period where they're in this much drabber plumage, but they still have the head. A lot of the markings on the head are still there. And then down in the bottom, these are females. As is the case with pretty much almost all duck species, the females have a lot subtler plumage. And that has to do with parental care and not wanting to be conspicuous. But similar size, that smaller bill, not a heavy, massive bill. They have the white patch behind the eye, and then this pale tawny patch just below the eye. And then, depending on the extent of that, sometimes you'll see these little patches right immediately around the eye. But males and females, you'll see mixed sex flocks. They will associate together during the non-breeding season. So those are harlequin ducks, buffleheads.
From me, one of them's from me.
Yeah,
I noticed that the females of harlequin ducks look similar-ish to female scoters and black scoter.
yes, they can. They're smaller than scoters, and the bills are considerably smaller relative to the head size. So in both the males and the females, if you with a lot, and this is going to be true of scoters, but this is something to keep in mind. It's not just the absolute bill size, it's the bill size relative to the head. And that gives you a frame of reference. And that's something you could then go to a field guide and say, okay, the bill was, about a third the length of the head, or it was a quarter the depth of the head. And in this case, harlequin ducks have this, it's not a dainty bill, but by duck standards, it's a fairly dainty bill, a fairly fine bill. And that is a distinct difference. And Toby, if you can remind me when we get to the scoters, I can try to point that out in the photos for scoter species. But even in the female scoters, which have less heavy bills than the males, the bill will look considerably longer and thicker, burlier than the bill of a harlequin duck will.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then is it possible that some harlequin ducks do not migrate, as this particular person said that they see them all summer long?
If so, those may be so yes, if they don't migrate, it means that they are not breeding that year. Um, so there's a few possible explanations for that. If you're seeing harlequin ducks throughout the summer, what we would need to do is know if they were the same individuals, and that would only be possible if they were banded or marked in some way. But a few possible explanations for that is that it's actually different birds coming in at different times. So you may have some birds that are non-breeders, but then you have some that actually fail to they bred, but they failed or they failed early, and they've come back into the system earlier than the successful breeders. So there's a few possible explanations for why you may see harlequin ducks year round. Um, the simplest one is that some birds don't come into breeding condition for whatever reason. They may not be well, they may not be in good body condition, and they've made a decision not to go to the breeding grounds because they're not in sufficiently good physical condition.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
also it's 7:30, so I think I'm going to hold off with the questions until the end now. We've only gone through two species.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. No, this
so
is the problem with folks who are highly engaged and curious and great naturalists.
so yeah, so
We
we'll
could spend
we'll
till
power through and
midnight
then we'll do questions at the end.
talking about this. Um, so buffleheads, oh, they're just spunky little ducks. They're just awesome little ducks. So they're our smallest duck that we see in our surveys on a consistent basis. The males are pretty unmistakable with that really clean water line of white, a clean break, and then they have this blackish iridescence, which again, under ideal light, you can see it iridesce in green, the big white patch behind the eye. Again, small duck, diving duck. The female's similar size. Bill is a similar color, that grayish brown color. But again, brown. They do have a fairly prominent, for a female duck, a prominent white patch behind the eye. So it's situated in the same position as the male head patch, but it's much reduced. So the combination of size and those head markings on both of the sexes is pretty diagnostic for buffleheads. Um, they do associate, and you see them commonly with golden eyes. We have two golden eye species in our region, Barrow's golden eye and the common golden eye. I'll start with the Barrow's golden eye. So Barrow's golden eye, it's a nice photo by Kim Stark, who is actually works for for King County and is a wonderful wildlife photographer. Um, this photo of Kim's up here shows very nicely the male and the female. You can see very clearly the golden eye. Um, Starting with the male, the really clean white breast, black bill, dark head, and they have this comma or curved white patch in front of the eye. The color of this, or sorry, the shape of this patch is one of the key distinguishing features between Barrows and common golden eyes. So for Barrows, it's a comma or a crescent. Um, they do show darker across the back and onto the flanks. So keep this in mind. I'll go to common in a moment. But there is white on the flanks. You can see it on both here, but they show a lot more black on the flanks, and they do have this ladder pattern or this hatched pattern of black and white across the wing. That is also a bit darker than in common golden eyes. Females, female golden eyes are pretty distinctive from non-golden eye females. They have a really nice chocolate, kind of milk chocolate colored head, both golden eye species. Both of them have a very similar kind of grayish mottled body. You can see it in the different profiles in these two photos. Um, they both have orange on the bills. The easiest way to distinguish between the males and the females is the extent of the orange on the bill. Um, Sometimes, again, under difficult light conditions, you can't see that, and you may need to. The males are easier under even pretty poor conditions to distinguish. Females can be a lot trickier. But I'll go to the next, and we can toggle back and forth if we need to. But here's a common golden eye. So you can see the white extends on the male rather than the black coming down across here. It's all white, and it's not that slotted black and white pattern across the wing. Um, and common golden eyes have a circular patch. Um, so this it's round rather than a crescent or a comma. Um, and if we look at the females, and here the lighting is different. So female commons will look under brighter conditions. The brown will look almost indistinguishable to that of a uh, a uh, a Barrows. But if you look at the bill color in the common goldeneye female is a gray, and all the only pink that the pink orange is at the tip of it. So it shows primarily gray with a little bit of pink. In contrast, if we go back, um, here you can see it's pinkish orange with just a little bit of dark. So the colors are effectively reversed. Um, and again, see how there's this really prominent black coming down a lot lower, showing a lot more black on the wing. The other thing I should mention too is that the males have this little spur of black that extends down almost to the waterline. Um, in contrast, the common goldeneye has a very clean white all the way across in the male. Okay. We good to keep going, Toby?
Uh, just one comment. A few people
Yeah.
have actually mentioned this, but I'll mention it too for those who are um, who maybe aren't as experienced. So I've always thought of these two ducks, the common being a dot on the face, and it's com, so comma dot com
Hmm.
for the common, and then for the barrows, it's bar rows. It's a row of bars on the side of their bodies.
Oh, I like that. I'd
You
never
go,
heard that one
if you go
before.
back to the barrows.
Yes, I'll let me yeah,
So it's bar rows and it's a row
these
of
bars
bars down
here
her back. Yeah.
right along here.
Yeah. So row of bars for barrows and then dot com for the dot on the face that is dot com and the com of common. Yeah,
Okay. .com. So appropriate for the Puget Sound region, right? The
exactly.
.com. Okay. Um, Scoters. So, and this is where I'll try to, well, we can start right now. Like, look at, and surf scoters have, of the three scoter species we see, they have the most massive bills relative to their head size. But you can see how heavy this bill is on this female surf scoter. So going back to Toby's comment earlier about the harlequin ducks, the pattern on the head, there's a bit, the coloring and the patterning is somewhat similar, but the bill is, 3 times as large relative to the head size for surf scoters. So you can use that as a reference. And the color is a bit different too. Again, if you can see the color under favorable light conditions. Um, Surf scoters are by far the most widespread and abundant of the three scoter species we get in our surveys in our inshore waters. I don't remember what the number is, Toby. It's like 95, 98% of all scoters are surf scoters, somewhere in that area. Um, so even without seeing the scoter, if someone said, I saw a scoter, you could say, it was a surf scoter, and you would nail it 95 to 98 times out of 100. Um, So that should kind of be your operating assumption is go with that. And you're like, that is not a surf scoter, then start to look at the other two. But the female again has the of these three species the heaviest bill relative to their head size. So these creamy patches on the side of the head, again in their favorable light, like this picture, you can see that clearly. Other times it's not quite as prominent. The males, black-bodied, they have this prominent white patch on the back of the neck, the white patch on the head, and then this really brightly colored bill, which has orange and red, this white, I'm not sure what shape that is, ovoid shape, kind of, with the black patch in the middle. And you can see them in large flocks. Again, depending on where you are, you can also see them in small isolated numbers, but it's not uncommon to see 10, 20, 50, 70, or 100 of them, depending on your survey sites. So I can move back and forth between these, but I want to just move through them to do these comparisons. So white-winged scoters of the two non-surf scoter species, this is the next most abundant. So these are seen way less commonly, but more commonly than black scoters. So the males have this little white marking around the eye, this lovely, graceful kind of a comma just under and behind the eye. You can see the bill is still a fairly heavy bill, but nowhere relative, again, to the head size, it's not nearly as heavy and thick as it is with the surf scoter. So looking at the massiveness of this bill, and then we go back, say, yeah, that's still a heavy bill, but not nearly as thick, and not as colorful. So it's a darker bill with a bit of coloration, orangish coloration towards the tip, but it's not a bright multicolored bill like the surf scoters. And then the females are darker than, again, under good light, they will show darker than the female surf scoters, and that gives more contrast to these patches. So the patches are similarly situated on the head of the females, but they will be more prominent in white-winged scoters, because the overall plumage surrounding it is a bit darker. Again, under favorable light conditions. And I put this one in flight. We don't count them in flight, but just to show you that they do have these white prominent secondaries, which really show most obviously in the males. Depending on how they're holding their wing, if they're sitting in the water, you may or may not see the white secondaries showing through, like you can in this bird here. But look at the bill size, the bill coloration, and then the head is black, so there's no white patch behind on the nape of the neck and the back of the head. And then this white, so it's lacking that. It doesn't have the white on top of the head like the surf scoter does, sorry, on the forehead. But it does have that really neat, graceful comma, almost like a Nike swoosh, that goes under and behind the eye. And then our third species is the black scoter. This is rarely seen in our surveys, but it does occur in our region. The female doesn't have those patches like the other two, but it does have this cap, this brownish cap that contrasts with the paler cheek and down onto some of the throat. You'll see a little bit of yellowish on the bill. The male has this prominent orange bump on the top of the bill. You can see that the males and females here in this really nice photo on the upper right. But they are black. The males are black. There's no other distinguishing marks on them. So if you see a scoter that shows no markings, it will likely be a black scoter. But again, low numbers and very localized in our region. Am I good to move on, Toby? Great. Mergansers. We have three species that we see in our area. Common mergansers are the least, despite the name common, depends where you are as to whether or not they're common. If we're looking in marine systems, common mergansers are a lot less abundant. We tend to see them year-round, much more in freshwater systems. It's not to say that you don't see common mergansers on salt water. You do, but they are much more likely to be seen in freshwater year-round. The male has this bright red bill, this black iridescent head, the very clean line across, and it shows their body shows a lot of white. The female, so I'll show you the red-breasted, well, actually, I'll just toggle between them. In contrast, the red-breasted merganser, it has an orange bill. The bill is not as bright. It doesn't contrast as strongly with the rest of the body as it does for the common merganser. It has a similar color, that blackish greenish head. You'll see much more of the tufts here on the crest on the back of the head. And then you see this scalloped reddish brown kind of cinnamon colored breast. This is pretty distinctive. And there's a lot more black on the body. There's some white, and then you've got this really neat marbled black and white down a bit lower. But if we toggle between these two, common merganser males, very white with that clean head, clean white breast, and then that contrasting very red bill. And then red-breasted mergansers have those distinguishing marks where there's a little bit of white, there's a white neck color, but then this scalloped reddish breast showing much darker on the back and the flanks. We look at the females, they look a lot more similar. One of the things to look for is how clean the break is between that reddish cinnamon color on their head and the neck. So on common mergansers, you can see in this really nice photo by Dennis Paulson, it's very clean. There's a sheer break between the two, between that reddish brown and then the gray. With the red-breasted merganser, you can see it's a gradation. It's a gradual transition, so it's not a clean break. And it shows a bit paler. So you have this subtle transition, a gradual transition into that brown. And it generally shows a bit paler right up into like the cheeks. But I'll go back and forth a couple of times so you can just see that. But the back of the mantle, the flanks look very similar. It's a fairly nondescript gray color in the two. But hopefully you can see that distinction clearly. And again, the female common merganser, if you get them in really nice light, the bill will look a little bit brighter in the common merganser than the red-breasted merganser, but that's highly dependent on light. Our third merganser, which is really a stunning merganser, is the hooded merganser. We see these year-round on fresh and salt water. The male is unmistakable. They have this odd, seemingly, the head itself is normally shaped, but the plumage gives it the appearance of an oddly shaped head. But this, you round it and then it's flattened and extended way back, almost like they're wearing a helmet. This large, prominent white patch behind the eye, bright yellow eye, black bill. You can see all three of the mergansers have very distinctive bills to compared to other ducks. And that is in large part derived from their diet. So all of these mergansers are primarily feeding on fish. So they're pursuit predators, they're diving, they're foot-propelled divers, and that is a bill that has evolved to specialize in feeding on fish. Most other diving ducks are feeding on aquatic invertebrates, like mollusks, etc. Um, Possibly things like shrimp and krill and other things, occasionally fish, but those bills are not well adapted to feed on fish, whereas the merganser complex, they are fish specialists, and hence the bill is slimmer, it's longer, it's finer. If you actually look at not that this is going to help you in the field on a Puget Sound Seabird survey, but if you were to actually look at the tongue has these serrations, these backward facing hooks, like other fish eating birds do. And that helps the bird, once it's caught a fish, to hold it in the bill successfully. Unmistakable males with this really beautiful kind of cinnamon color on the flanks, this alternate white and black striping, white breast. The females, again, are subtler with their plumage, but they still have that spectacular hairdo. Um, and um, and if you see them in good light, like in this photo, although the colors are subtler, they're pretty stunning. There's a lot of color gradations in the female hooded mergansers. This paler brown up here into a grayish brown, darker gray across the wings and the mantle. So hooded mergansers, really quite distinctive. Long-tailed ducks, these are highly localized. In places they're consistently seen, but most of our survey sites, we don't see long-tailed ducks. In part because they tend to prefer deeper water. And so unless you have a site that is adjacent to, or that is, yes, adjacent to bathymetry that drops off really quickly. So you are within, 100 or 200 meters of deep water from your survey site, you're probably not going to see long-tailed ducks within your survey area. Really stunning birds. Again, pretty unmistakable plumage. This is a male here in winter plumage with the long tail. The females don't have the long tail, it's just the males. But these alternate white and black striping, little patches of brown in places, the black patch behind the eye, grayish wash on the head. And then the bill has that really neat pink ring around it. So it's black at the base, pink, and then a black tip. The lower right photo, which shows a male in breeding plumage in the background. So this is now, and you may see a bird like this right at the end of the winter season. So as they're transitioning up into the to migrate to the breeding grounds. So they develop some really neat brown colors on the wings. But the female here is in the foreground, similar bill shape, gray, this really neat, clean white white eye patch, contrasting a dark cap and some white patches, but showing overall like a grayish brown color. But the males, if you see the males, they're unmistakable. You'll see those clearly, and that will help you make sense of the females. And during the winter season, males and females are hanging around a lot, so it's pretty rare to see unaccompanied female ducks because of their life history strategy, and males are typically trying to mate guard and dominate females. So you don't see many unattended female ducks during our surveys, typically. Okay, so those were all diving ducks. So transitioning to dabbling ducks, we have American widgeons, which are primarily freshwater, but we get them in saltwater. Down here in the Tacoma area, we regularly see them in inshore areas. Really lovely ducks. They're common enough that I think sometimes we can easily take them for granted until we start to look at them closely again. But if you look at all of the different plumage patterns and colorations on this male in this photo, it's really quite stunning. But there's the green stripe through the eye that comes back, behind the eye and towards the neck, the pale creamy color patch on the head, the dappled pattern on the neck and the cheek, pale gray bill with the dark tip, cinnamon colors on the flanks, the little white kind of butt patch on the flank, towards the back towards the butt, dark tail, and then the females, and even the females here again, subtle, understated, but look at the complexity of the plumage colorations on this female. It's a lovely photo here. Uh, Different patterns, different colors. Including these on the primaries here, you can see a dark primary, but it's frosted with this pale coloration around the tips and around the edges. The coverts have this lovely scalloped coloring, rich cinnamon color on the flanks, but then you've got this most leopard skin pattern on the belly, and the upper chest. So American widgeons, abundant, pretty widespread, primarily freshwater, but you can see them on saltwater. We do occasionally get, in certain areas and some consistent places right here in Tacoma where we see Eurasian widgeons. So these are a couple of my photos. Here is a Eurasian widgeon mixed into a flock of American widgeons, with possibly a hybrid back here, but we're not going to get into that. But when you do look at your widgeon flocks, look for, it's that classic Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. You'll sometimes see a Eurasian widgeon surreptitiously in there. A lot of the markings look similar, but what you'll see is the head. The head is very different. You've got that really rich reddish brown head, and instead of that pale tawny stripe on the forehead, it's a more of a pale orange, but quite distinctive if you get a good look at the head. So just something to keep in mind. We see I don't know if we've actually ever recorded one in our surveys. Probably a few somewhere, but it's not something you're likely to see. I'm not going to insult you by going in detail of the detail of plumage of a mallard, but the one thing I would say is the next time you see a mallard, take a moment to appreciate it. They are cursed by being abundant, widespread, successful species. We've all seen thousands and thousands of mallards, and I think it's really easy to take them for granted. But I challenge you to find a more stunningly plumaged bird in North America than a male mallard. If you just take that moment to look in good light, they are absolutely gorgeous. It's just that we've all seen 10,000 of them, and it's easy to forget that. So that's all I'm going to say on mallards. Brant. Mallards are also dabbling. So they're the ones that tip up, don't dive. You see their butts in the air, just like the widgeons. Brant are also, these are geese now. These are dabblers, they're not divers. Pretty distinctive, mainly black body. They have this lovely white necklace or collar. You can see the extent of which varies between individuals. But when you see them in the water, they have a relatively small bill compared to the head. Black bill, that collar. They show very dark. Even on the land, you can see how much of their body is black. They have some white on the flanks with some gray streaks, and then white as you move back towards the butt. And you typically see those, inshore in areas where there's eelgrass, and in decent sized flocks. So leaving the ducks and the geese behind, moving into loons, We have three species that we see on a somewhat regular basis, depending again on your site. Um, Aptly enough, the most common of those is the common loon. This is the largest of the three species. You'll see them in a variety of plumages. Like you'll see them in sometimes in October, still largely in breeding plumage, like this bird in the Josh Merrill's photo in the bottom. Um, Many times early in the season, we'll see them where they're transitioning, where they're losing that really striking breeding plumage and going into more of that drab winter plumage. This is a transitional bird, so it's molting. Its head and breast has gone fully molted into winter, but it's still got some of that checkerboard pattern across the back. Um, and then this photo in the upper left shows one in full winter plumage. By far the largest of the three loons. So it is, these are big, heavy-bodied birds. And one of the keys, if you don't have a size reference, I know size can be challenging if you don't have a point of contrast. Um, but looking at the size of the bill, so there's plumage indicators, there's bill color, and there's the bill size relative to the head. Common loons have it's a straight bill, but it's a heavy, thick, straight bill. By far the heaviest bill relative to the head size of the loons that we see. Um, in the winter plumage, they show a pretty clear white throat with a bit of this dark color coming across, but pretty clean in the throat down onto the breast. Um, so that's a common loon, and we'll come back to these and do some comparisons. Pacific loons, here's breeding plumage. They are gorgeous birds, a lot less abundant in our survey areas. But breeding plumage, here's one in the upper right in wintering plumage with a common loon in the background. I love this photo. It's not, unfortunately, the common loon in the background isn't super sharp, but this bird is behind the Pacific loon. So the perspective is it's smaller, but you can see how much bigger, even with the distance accounted for. It is a considerably bigger bird. And look at the size of the bill on this common loon behind it relative to the Pacific loon. This is a much finer bill relative to the bird's body and head than this bill is on the common loon in the background. So they also get a lot drabber in the winter months, lose a lot of, they lose the wonderful striping on their neck. They lose that neat sheen on the back of their head, that really neat transition from the almost glowing gray into the dark charcoal around the face in the breeding season. Again, this checkerboard, that largely goes away. They go into a much subtler, more cryptic plumage with a little bit of streaking here, but mainly white along the throat and onto the upper breast. Third species, red-throated loon. We don't tend to see them in their full breeding plumage, but I put this in just in case, just to show you that they also go through a significant molt. How we typically see them is on the right here. We don't see the red throat, or maybe just a hint of it on the throat. So we do see is a bit of paleness around the bill. The bill it's the palest of the three. This kind of mottled gray, smudgy looking throat. So it's the least clean looking throat of the three loons. And again, just a more delicate looking loon. It doesn't have that massive, powerful look of the common loon. So if we look at them together, and these are not to scale, but common loon is in the upper left, and they have this little white collar that comes across with this spur of black that occludes part of the whiteness of the throat. Dark back, heavy bill relative to the head. Up here is the Pacific loon. clean white. You don't see that collar across the gray. You don't see that little spur, but a much slimmer bill. And then red-throated down here. This bird is actually showing a lot more white than the previous bird. Previous bird was, I think, still transitioning in plumage. But there's a subtle behavioral thing that you can sometimes see. Red-throated loons had the tendency, and this photo captures it nicely, to hold their bill above the horizontal, which is something you see cormorants frequently do too. Um, these other two species tend to hold the bill horizontally when they're just cruising around. Red-throated loons tend to have the bill above horizontal. So it's almost like it looks like they're looking up a little bit or across their bill. Not always, but it's a really common behavioral trait of that species. Okay, moving from loons to grebes. And we have three species here that horned grebes are by far the most abundant and widespread that we see. Again, we tend not to see these stunning the plumages of breeding season, although in our March and sometimes in March, if you catch grebes in April, horned grebes in April, you may see, or some lingering birds into May, you may see them in this plumage, and it is stunning. We generally see them when they're in their winter plumage over here in these right images. These are small grebes, about this big. They look like they're tailless. They have a very short tail. They have this rounded back, fairly slim neck, fairly short neck, a bit of gray on the throat, whitish breast, and then they have this clean triangular area below the eye with a very clean stripe below the red eye, and then a dark cap. So a grayish blackish cap, and then the pale, fairly slim bill. Um, they look very, very similar to to eared grebes. In our region, most of what we see are horned grebes, but it is worth having a close look at the small grebes that you see in your surveys. Um, Horned grebes, again, have that really clean break and a very clear white patch on their cheek and down into their upper throat. And a clean black cap with the line that goes almost through the eye. Eared grebes have a dark cap, but you can see they don't have that clean, there's an indistinct break. It's smudgy. They have a bit of white, and there's some variability in this, but they show darker on the face and the upper throat than the horned grebe. So it's worth keeping an eye out for that because they do occur, but they're a lot less widespread and abundant in our region relative to horned grebes. They're both lovely little birds. These are all, I should mention that loons are also foot-propelled divers, as are grebes. So everything they do is propelled by feet underwater. The third species that actually I misspoke. There's four that we see on a somewhat regular basis. Red-necked grebes, again, breeding plumage, we tend really not to see them in this plumage. They look more like this in the winter months. Yellowish bill with the black on the upper mandible, a bit of a white patch here. These are larger grebes, considerably larger than, and not as rounded looking as the horned and the eared grebes. They have this pale patch, and then the dark back of the neck and dark flanks like sides of the neck with a paler breast and central throat area. Red-necked grebes, depending on your site, they tend to prefer deeper water. So if you're in an area that has a really gradual slope out into your survey zone, you're unlikely to see red-necked grebes within your survey area. They're more commonly seen 400-500 meters, a kilometer offshore, unless you have a place where it drops off pretty quickly into deep water. Um, and then our fourth somewhat regular species is a western grebe. This is another species that is highly localized, and also tends to prefer deep water during the day. So you generally see them farther offshore during the daylight hours. They'll come in a little bit closer during at nighttime. So you may see them, but frequently if you do, they're going to be well beyond your survey area. Um, this is the largest of our grebes in our area. Long, graceful white neck with the dark gray back of the neck, but there's that really clean contrast. Um, and it comes up with the black coming below the eye. They have a clean, dark blackish head, prominent red eye, and then this olive greenish yellow bill, really long, slim bill. The body is rounded, like grebes, also looks tailless. And it's this mottled grayish plumage across the mantle on the back and on the flanks. There is another species that we do see in our area. So technically we have five, but these are even less common. And we get very, very few of them in our surveys. And that's Clark's grebe. It's going to look superficially like a Western grebe. The photo down here is a nice comparison. So the main differences are bill color. So you can see if we go back, this is, it's yellowish, but it's an olive yellow in the Western grebe. And you can see where that cap comes down below the eye, the black cap. Whoops, wrong direction. In contrast, Western grebes, the bill is a bright yellow. Sorry, in Clark's grebes, the bill is a bright yellow, and the cap is clearly above the eye. So when you look at them, they look much whiter on the face, and that bill is considerably brighter looking. In this photo down here, you can see that really nicely. Same light. Look at how yellow this Clark's grebes bill is compared to the coloration of that olivish color on the Western grebe to the right. And again, the extent of the black on the head is another really nice distinguishing characteristic between the two of them. You tend to see Clark's grebes when you see them mixed in the minority with Western grebes, at least in my experience. And again, they tend to be in deeper water, farther offshore. Okay, transitioning again to cormorants. So we've got three species that we see pretty consistently in our waters: double-crested cormorants, pelagic cormorants, and branch cormorants. Of the three, double-cresteds are the largest. They can be seen, although this does say August to May, they are seen year-round in our waters. This is when they're kind of most consistently seen. They have a juvenile plumage. Their bodies are all black. And then they have this orangish feather-free area around the bill. So that's something that you can look for. Again, under decent to good light, that's very diagnostic. They're the largest of the three. They're the most heavily bodied. And so some things to look at when you're thinking about identifying cormorants is size, coloration, and then the size and the shape of the bill relative to the head, and then the markings around the bill. So double cresteds have the heaviest bills relative to their head size. They have that really clear orange markings around the base of the bill and below the eye. They show as black. They have juvenile plumage. So this photo up in the upper right shows that even the juveniles have that orange around on the face, but then they've got this brownish plumage that they go into adult plumage in their second or third year. I mention that because not all cormorants have a juvenile plumage. So pelagics go straight into the adult plumage. So another thing, if you see them in flight, I don't want to dwell on this because we're not dealing with birds in flight, but if you see them in flight, double-crested cormorants will usually, you can see this kink in the neck in this bottom photo of the bird in flight. So they don't hold their neck straight. It's shaped a little bit like this. And it is a really thick, heavy neck. Um, the second one in size is the Brandt's cormorant. So they are similar in size to double cresteds, but they're smaller. Their neck is a bit slimmer. They're not as bulky and heavy looking as a double crested, which that comes with just looking at a lot of cormorants, and just getting a feel for the heaviness of body, the bulkiness of, a double-crested cormorant. Brandt's cormorants in breeding season are pretty striking birds. They will grow out these phyloplumes, these white plumes, which are modified feathers on their backs and kind of on the back of their cheeks, on their heads. They have this year round, they have this tawny patch, this kind of cream colored patch underneath the base of the bill. In the breeding season, where the double cresteds have the orange, Brandts have a reduced patch, which is this really bright blue. So you can see breeding plumage on the left, and then on the right is an adult in non-breeding plumage, which is how we see most of our Brandt's cormorants. Third cormorant is the pelagic cormorant. It's the smallest of the three. It is by far the slimmest, and it is noticeably smaller and much more finely featured. So they have a dark bill, slim bill, not nearly as heavy a bill relative to the head. The neck is very slim looking, and you look at this in the lower right, the pelagic cormorant in flight. Look at the neck and how slim that looks. I'm just going to go back really quickly compared to a double-crested cormorant. It's a longer, slimmer neck relative to the body size in pelagics compared to double-cresteds. For part of the time that we see them during this non-breeding season, you may be able to see these white butt patches, which come in as they come into breeding plumage. They have a much longer tail relative to their body. So you can see this really long looking tail. It's almost half of the length of their main body, primary body, their torso. Much longer than here. You can see, although the angle's a little different, you can see Brandt's cormorants have a much shorter tail relative to their body size. So again, a lot of this is comparing and recognizing proportions of parts of the body to the overall body size. This upper right photo shows you the size difference. So same piling, this is a pelagic cormorant on the left and a double-crested cormorant on the right. So you can see absolute size, but then the thickness of the neck, the heaviness of the bill, the difference in coloration in good light, you'll see this iridescence in the pelagic cormorant that neither of the other two species has. So I pulled these are from the Sibley guide, but you can see the orange throat. So this is the double-crested cormorant on the left. These are just pulled directly from the guide. The adult down here. Juvenile Brandts are a bit darker, but they do have a fairly obvious juvenile stage. They have a thick neck, but it's straighter than what we see in the double cresteds. And then as we transition over, you have the dark face on the pelagic cormorants, the thin straight neck, the very thin dark bill, and then that iridescence on the body. And then this shows you really nicely the tail relative to the body size in the three of them. And you can see how much longer the pelagic cormorant's tail is. They can be tricky. But hopefully that gives you some hints. Gulls, I think we're going to move through pretty quickly.
Peter,
Yes,
in respect of time, it's
yeah,
8:17. I
yeah,
was wondering, thinking that maybe we split this class into two,
sure.
because there are still quite a few to go. You've got all the girls, and then you've got Alcids.
Yes.
And the girls, I
I've got
think,
another like 14 slides.
yeah,
Yes,
I know girls are
we could definitely
classically
do
difficult.
a second night, and that also makes it more digestible.
Yeah, I think so.
Folks.
Because girls are so tricky, I think folks might want a little bit of extra time on girls, maybe.
Well,
And
I want extra time with gulls.
yes, we all do. So yeah, so maybe, yeah, if you're comfortable with it, we'll call it a night there for your
Yeah,
slides.
I like
And
that suggestion, Toby. Yeah. And
on
maybe
to a
for
few
folks
questions.
that are still like want to keep going, if you've got questions, we could open it up for 10 or 15 minutes of questions.
Yeah, there are a couple that I've got here that folks threw out. Oh yeah, somebody made a comment which is really interesting. So Clark's grebe is to Western grebe, i.e., where the kind of the colors of the cap and how it smudges into the cheek.
Hmm.
Is eared is to horned grebes.
Yeah, yeah. So there
Interesting
is
way of
some,
thinking it that way.
yeah, there's a little bit of parallel there. Um, the Clark's grebe has a much cleaner and whiter contrast. There's a lot more white than, say, the eared grebe has. But that comparison could be helpful for some folks. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. How to identify common loon female versus Western grebe in low light. Common loon female,
And let's
Western
add
grebe.
in driving rain with 3 feet breaking seas just to add to the challenge. Um, sorry that it's getting late. I was
Yeah,
getting
yeah, yeah,
ahead.
for sure.
So common loon. So well, common loons are monomorphic. So males and females will look the same. Um, so that's not going to be a confounding factor. But so it was common loons with um, could you reread that, Toby? Sorry.
I'm trying to find it. To identify common loon female versus Western grebe. Common loon female.
Okay, so Western grebes are going to be um, so loons, all of the loons, if you look at their profile in the water, and let me just go back. So with grebes, all of the grebes to a greater or lesser extent, they have a fairly rounded back. Um, so it goes from the neck and then it rises up and they have this rounded back and it drops into the water at a pretty good angle. And so you can see that I'm not going to dwell on these photos, but um, a little less pronounced in redneck grebes. But if I want to get back to loons have a much more elongated body. And so when you look at them, even if you don't have a scale to say how big they are, look at the shape of the back. Loons look almost flat across the back. Here's all 3 species. And yes, there's a bit of camber to it, but the overall impression is they're pretty low in the water and fairly flat. And they, transition down into the water rather than having a more rounded shape. So part of it could be body shape. Another thing you can look at is the heaviness of the neck. Um, Even in the smaller loons, the neck relative to the head and the body is thicker than it is in Western and Clark's grebes. Western and Clark's grebes have a very graceful, slim neck and quite long relative to the body. So these don't all have their necks fully extended, but these are fairly, at least for the common loon in the upper left and the red-throated loon down in the bottom here, those are fairly typical postures. And yep, they have the neck is discrete, but it's not particularly long relative again to the body. So if we then move back to like a Western grebe, you can see that neck is slimmer and longer relative to the body and the head than the loons. So those are some things that I would look at. And then the other thing I would look at is the bill. The bill is so much slimmer in a Western grebe and a Clark's grebe. Really, it's pencil-like. And that is definitely not the case. It would be most similar in a red-throated loon, in that lower panel, um, but definitely much finer. Like, it would be half of the width. It would be the upper mandible, the upper part of the bill of this common loon, just to give you a sense of scale for that. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's great. And one person said, which I like, loons are battleships, grebes are tugboats.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I may need to borrow that. Let me know if I should copyright that or I should attribute that to someone's copyrighted that. I love hearing how people describe things. That's always a fun part of these classes is you're out there, you've got your own ideas as well, and skills and things that you use as cues.
Yes, it's helpful for everyone, I think, having these different ideas of how to visualize things. So this is great. Okay, well, I don't think we have any more clear questions right now. Lots of people appreciate the idea of having a second class. So provided you're comfortable with doing that, Peter, let's set one up maybe for January and New Year. Um,
That sounds
and
great.
yeah, we'll look at those gulls. Can't wait, huh?